Bonsoir à tous. Donc merci d'être venus. Et donc nous recevons dans le cadre des cafés scientifiques M. Zachary Subin, donc qui travaille à E3, right? It's the name of the company.
Yep.
Qui fait consulting company, right? So he has already done a talk to our students about climate change and how all the science there is to monitor this climate change and what reality it is and how urgent it is to find a solution about it. And now in the second talk, he's going to talk more about what he's working on a daily basis in California, I guess, most likely.
Mostly, but yeah, we're working on a big national
as
right
well.
now, too.
So to find solutions about this climate change. Thank you so much for coming and being with us, even with this small audience. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Okay. Yeah, you want to go ahead to next slide? So this is an introduction. You saw this already, but with a slightly different slide background template. So this is just kind of who I am. So I did physics for undergrads and was really kind of, my dream in high school was to be like a theoretical physicist, actually. So it was kind of cool to talk to the high school students. And then I got a little bit derailed in college with, lots of interesting political issues. So I did a grad school degree at Berkeley and kind of a joint degree between public policy and this program called Energy and Resources, which is an interdisciplinary approach to environmental problems. And it's, tying together economics and engineering and social science and, all the different kind of pieces. I did PhD work in global climate modeling and then have come to E3 to work on climate change solutions. And E3 was founded about 30 years ago, starting off with just a handful of people. And they've kind of developed this toolkit of economics for the electricity industry. And as electricity and climate change issues have kind of intersected more and more, that's become a more dominant feature of E3's practice area. So we consult for state governments, utilities, renewable developers, all sorts of people that have some role to play in the energy system. So I'm going to talk about kind of the big challenge of what we call decarbonization, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, mostly carbon dioxide. Then I'm going to talk about some work that I've done, that I've been a part of for California, using a model we call Pathways. And then I'm going to talk at the end, just kind of a preview of like interesting things that we're starting to work on now and policy issues that everyone should be thinking about. Okay. So we need to have pretty drastic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in the next few decades. The 2015 agreement in Paris committed the industrialized countries to 80% reductions below 1990 levels by 2050. And that's basically consistent with a goal that's been around since the early 2000s of kind of an upper limit of 2 degrees Celsius average temperature increase. And that 2 degree number is kind of a, what people thought was a safe kind of cautious number. And it's always important to keep in mind that Celsius is different than Fahrenheit. Maybe for this audience, you're more familiar with Celsius than the average American, but something to always remind people. And also, this is a global average metric. So changes in terms of summer heat waves in a land area, particularly high latitudes, could be much greater than that average. And actually, 2C isn't necessarily as low as we'd like to be. So there was a report written in October, special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius, and this was basically asked for by some island nations during the negotiations in 2015, saying, 2 degrees, we might still be a little bit underwater. Maybe you guys should push a little harder. Why not write a report on going beyond 2 degrees? And that's still kind of new work, so most of what I'm going to talk about is more kind of in line with this 2 degree goal. So this is kind of where we are and where we need to be in terms of emissions and where we'll end up in terms of temperature change by 2100. So, 10 years ago when people were running climate models, kind of tracing out what we call business as usual scenarios, we're on track to 4 to 5 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100, which would be pretty severe. Current policies and kind of trends with using more renewables have gotten us more into this level of maybe 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, maybe an optimistic interpretation of things that governments have committed to, if they actually implemented them, would be the low end of that range. And then we're trying to get to 2 degrees or below. And this is the different emissions trajectory over time that would be consistent with that. So what we want to be is these trajectories that actually kind of around now start going way down, and actually some of them go negative towards the end of the century to take back up emissions to compensate for the emissions that we've already done before. So it's a pretty aggressive time frame. So this is sort of pie charts of where the emissions come from. And so this is a global estimate. This pie chart is by gas. This pie chart is just by economic sector. So it's kind of 2 different ways of looking at the same thing. You can see by gas, carbon dioxide is the biggest wedge, and most of that is fossil fuel emissions. We get to see music again.
Sorry about that. I get disconnected from the other card. I don't know.
Yeah. So the biggest wedge here is the burning of fossil fuels, and that's kind of the biggest focus of my work, is this big wedge. There's also people who focus on methane, such as from agriculture, from cows and rice, and then other things like refrigerant gases that are used in refrigerators and propellants and sort of industrial chemicals. And if you look by sector, most of this CO2 is in industries like electricity, energy, industrial consumption for manufacturing, and then transportation would be a lot bigger within the US. I'll get to that, but as a global average, it's only 14%. And then this agriculture and land use category is sort of some of the miscellaneous wedges over here. And then if you look at the magnitude of emissions per person, it's kind of a way to think of everything on an equal footing. The U.S. represented 15% of global emissions in 2014, which is a number that's been declining as other countries industrialize, and also the U.S. has less heavy industry than it used to, and there's some switch from coal to natural gas. But we're still well above, per person, we're still well above the global average. So the US is emitting 19 tons per year per person. The global average is about 7. And where we want to be by 2050 is less than 2. So that is why we have a lot of work to do in the next few years. So we talk about pillars of decarbonization, and the idea of conceptualizing it as a pillar is that you kind of need to do everything. So I'm going to give some examples, but you actually have to do all of these things in combination to meet your goals of reducing emissions. So, for instance, if you wanted to get rid of CO2 emissions from gasoline in your car, you could buy a more efficient car and drive less. So that would be energy efficiency and conservation. You can buy an electric car because we know increasingly how to make clean electricity. So that would be electrification. For your kind of backup second car that you use occasionally for trips to the mountains, make sure to use biofuel. So that would be an example of low carbon fuels, sort of for the things that you can't electrify. And then the fourth thing would be, in this example, some of the refrigerants in your car's air conditioning have an outsized warming potential per per molecule, it's not that much volume of gas, but it still has a big impact. So make sure to dispose of it properly and to switch to better chemical alternatives. So that's an example of we call them non-energy or non-CO2 emissions. So there's actually been a lot of work over the past 5 to 10 years about how to kind of map this out at a global scale of how to get from where we are to where we want to be. So this is just one example of a scenario that was put out, I think, last year, 2 years ago, of emissions reductions globally consistent with 2 degrees Celsius of warming. And you can see that electricity shrinks the most. The electricity is power is the orange. So this one shrinks down almost entirely. And you have emissions left in heavy-duty transportation and industry. So the story is kind of doing the things that we know how to do first, and then other stuff that we're still working on innovation will come later. And there was this project called Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, and it involved teams from a couple dozen countries, and they were all able to come up with scenarios that, consistent with their economies, how those economies looked, were consistent with maintaining economic growth while decarbonizing, reaching this 80% emission reductions goal. So this chart just shows that there's kind of a variety of countries in terms of how much they're emitting versus how big their economy is. And the US is up here. So this is, we have a lot of wealth per person, but we also emit a huge amount. And there's countries in here, like in Western Europe and Japan, that have, pretty good economies, but aren't emitting nearly as much. And all the countries can get, ideally, to here where there's healthy economies and lower emissions. So among the different countries, there were different strategies of how to achieve low carbon electricity. So some countries where, like Brazil, where you have a lot of sun and a lot of wind and a lot of hydro, you could do mostly renewable. Other countries, there was a more heavy reliance on nuclear or fossil fuels with CCS, which is where you burn the fuel, but you capture the CO2 before it goes into the atmosphere and put it back underground. And as time goes on, the innovation in the renewable technologies, wind, solar, and batteries, kind of keeps getting better and better and exceeding everyone's expectations. So, you'd probably want to move some of these bars over, and if you reran this now instead of 2015 when this was run, and rely more heavily on renewables. But we still think that there's places where if you keep these other options on the table, it can help you get to where you need to be. So, there's places that just don't have much sun, don't have much wind. So having nuclear or fossil fuels with CCS can help you kind of have a full complement of strategies. So to kind of bring it to everyday technologies that you're familiar with, and sort of the two areas that are our biggest focus now, I think, are electric vehicles and heat pumps. So these are examples of technologies that right now are burning gasoline in the case of vehicles, or burning natural gas in the case of gas furnaces in your home. And we can convert them to efficient electric alternatives that use less energy, and the energy that's going into them is much cleaner. So in most of the country, this switch would save emissions right now, except in some places that have almost exclusively coal-fired electricity. In California, our electricity mix is already pretty clean, so we already see big emission reductions from these two examples. This is kind of a picture of, I've been a guinea pig over the past year, so I got a heat pump in my house instead of a gas furnace. And a heat pump is basically just a reverse air conditioner. So it looks like an air conditioner, but it provides heating as well as cooling. So it's moving heat from the outside inside instead of burning something to make heat. and thus it's much more efficient. And this one's kind of tongue-in-cheek because this is my new car, which is the scooter over there. Actually, do you want to go back to?
Sure.
So, so I mentioned as electricity gets cleaner and cleaner, these will get better and better, but we still kind of need more policy because we can't just wait for people to learn to like these on their own because we don't have, we don't have that much time to meet these emission targets. So that's why we're working on Pathways for California, and Pathways is kind of a, what do you call it? It's an acronym. It's both a model name and it's a concept that you kind of have to map out where you are and where you want to be over a long period of time to figure out how your infrastructure will transition. So comparing California to the US, California is kind of ahead in that we had a lot of early action to reduce reliance on coal and increase energy efficiency. We also have abundant hydroelectricity and renewables, and we have limited heavy industry. So putting all those things together, we're around 11 tons per capita, while the country on average is around 19 tons. Transportation is the biggest single category in California. That's mostly cars and personal cars and trucks. And they're still smaller on an absolute basis than per person than other places in the country, but because our emissions pie is overall smaller, transportation's the biggest proportion. So California has some pretty aggressive climate commitments, basically going out to 2050 in concert with what I guess all the countries agreed they were going to do at a national scale in Paris, which is to get to this 80% emission reduction goal by 2050. And we've kind of, didn't want to sort of leave the hard stuff till the end, so we made this intermediate target of 40% reduction by 2030. And you can see the line to get from here down to here is actually the steepest part of the curve. So that's, I guess this is 2020, so we have one more year to start heading down like that. So the reason we have to start thinking now about where we're going to be in 2050 is because all of these technologies last so long. So light bulbs kind of turn over quickly. Water heaters a little more slowly, and then going down to the scale of building a new building and thinking about what kind of heating system you're going to put in. Basically, buildings that are built now are still going to be around in 2050. So you have to kind of work backwards from where you want to be, and cars you might buy only 1 or 2 more cars before 2050. So if you don't buy an electric vehicle in this cycle, you might have to make sure you do it in the next cycle if you want an electric vehicle to be on the road by 2050. So that's kind of the core of the motivation for the Pathways model. The Pathways model sort of tracks the stocks of different technologies in the economy. So, for instance, this is a chart of trucks. So this orange is the current trucks, and you're kind of moving gradually to more efficient or electric trucks over time. And so we keep track of, we have a model like that for all of these different important end uses in buildings, in transportation. We have residential and commercial buildings, heaters, light bulbs, cars, trucks. So we kind of add up all that, figure out what kinds of electricity go in, and also track costs over time. So there's, energy and environmental economics includes the word economics, so people are often really interested in costs, but it's also kind of some of the most uncertain projections that we make. So I'm going to focus here on kind of primarily on the physical system. But the important metric on cost is that we think we can do all this without affecting the overall economy. It's going to be a small proportion of economic growth wouldn't have to be directed to these sort of investments.
Is there already such thing as an electric truck that can transport heavy material?
Yeah, so they're working on it. it's much easier for short haul than long haul. So a lot of trucks, like in the port of LA, just kind of go back and forth for 20 or 30 miles. So those could conceivably be electrified, with kind of the batteries we have now. Tesla says that it can do the 500-mile trucks, but we're still kind of waiting to see. And hydrogen fuel cell trucks would be another alternative that could go a longer distance. So the first project I want to talk about is the scoping plan. And going back to 2006, Governor Schwarzenegger and the California State Legislature created the first commitment for 2020, which is now only a year away. And the goal was to basically return to 1990 levels instead of growing. And that created this process where every few years the Air Resources Board would kind of assess what progress is made, where we are, and where we need to be. So we did an update of that in 2016, based on this new target of getting to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. And we developed a bunch of different scenarios, this pathways model, to kind of add up, this is the number of cars that we have, this is the number of electric cars we need, this is the number of heaters, heat pumps, and so on throughout the economy. So yeah?
Can you go back to that other side? So, where are we on the 1990 scale for 2020?
We exceeded that goal, I think, last year.
Okay.
But the progress hasn't been even. So we're doing better than we expected in electricity, but not doing as well as we expected in transportation.
What about the isolation of buildings and stuff like that? Also, you also take that in account on your models?
The insulation, you said?
Isolation of buildings,
So the main kind of output of that study was kind of quantifying through 2030 where all of the emission savings would come from. So a lot of this is kind of defining where you think you already would have been without new policy. So the electricity bar, this 50% renewables portfolio standard, is pretty small. And that's only because we've already thought we were going to get to 40%. So we're kind of doing well there. Other areas where we thought existing policies were going to help us would be energy efficiency, truck and vehicle programs. Short-lived climate pollutants are actually really important over the next 10 years. So this is methane from dairies. When I was talking before about the methane from cows, there are some solutions. We don't know how to get all the way to reducing their emissions, but they have ideas about how to get, say, 40% of the way there for cows. And part of it is just collecting manure and processing it centrally and keeping the methane from getting in the atmosphere.
Or we could eat insects.
Yeah. The California dairy industry might not like that idea, but fine with me. So then this is the project that I worked on last year. So going beyond 2030 to 2050, we looked at a bunch of different scenarios, starting with kind of a business as usual case, and then moving through the screen line is like the known kind of policies on the books that were enforceable. So not just the sort of governor's goal, but like, which things could the Air Resources Board enforce now with existing law we thought could get us like to there. And then we had 10 different scenarios for how to get to here. And those scenarios each kind of tested slightly different sets of technologies. Like maybe you don't have as much heat pumps, you have to do more of something else. And one innovation of this work was kind of less reliance on biofuels. So you were mentioning before that people people found there's unintended consequences from heavy reliance on biofuels. And a lot of the previous studies have assumed that biofuels are sort of like a silver bullet. Like, oh, you have the same kinds of vehicles, you just drop in a clean fuel instead of a dirty fuel. But a lot of research is finding that it's can have a lot of negative consequences for using land for fuel that could have been used for food or for fiber, because basically there's still demand for those things and you're just pushing it somewhere else. So we tried to use less biofuels, and that means more reliance basically on electricity, on clean electricity.
And what about the third generation biofuels, where they just use the root of the plant, or just not the whole plant, so that you can still use the plant to feed people and use the
so that's basically, so this chart shows the different sources of biofuels by 2040. So we basically focus on these yellow ones, which are residues, where you already have the crop, but maybe you have the straw or the roots. And then we're excluding these blue bars where you have a field that's basically exclusively dedicated to growing crops for fuel.
Plus the problem of loss of biodiversity.
Right.
Some
right.
area in the world, right?
Mm-hmm. So the 4 pillars of decarbonization that I mentioned, you need all of them in all of the scenarios. It's just kind of varying degrees. So for instance, the overall energy per person declines by almost 2/3. And that's partly because of things like efficient light bulbs, but it's also because switching to electricity entails a lot of efficiency. Because, for instance, an electric motor is much more efficient than an internal combustion engine. So you're, in a typical car, you're sort of throwing away 2/3 of the energy, whereas an electric car, you get more like 80% of the energy to the wheels directly from the battery. So we need to do all of these things, and to meet the state's climate goals, we have to start basically now and accelerate very rapidly over the next 10 years. So this is where emissions are today. It's just another way of looking at that pie chart, but in a bar chart format. And you can see that the biggest bar here is basically cars and SUVs. And then the second biggest bar is buildings, which includes electricity and natural gas, as well as some refrigerants that are used in like building refrigerators and air conditioners. So now if you go to the next slide, that shows where our scenarios bring us in 2050. And you'll notice that the 2 bars that started the highest are actually now the lowest. So even though cars and buildings seem like the biggest source of emissions now, we also know where, like, how to get to near zero emissions in both of those, and it's just a matter of getting consumers to participate. Whereas some of these other sectors, like industrial cement production, we don't really have great options, just kind of sitting on the shelf. So it's all about kind of attacking the first 80% that you know how to do, and then continuing to innovate for the last 20%. So this one's kind of an animation one by one of all the measures that we're going to be doing on this scenario. So it's just kind of when you see sort of the total emissions number, it doesn't sound as challenging as it is, when you look at each of these things that we have to do. So this one we've already accomplished 40% renewable electricity just about by 2020. We should be starting to install, according to this particular scenario, we should be starting to install electric heat pumps, doing industrial energy efficiency. 30% of new cars by 2025 would have to be electric vehicles, with a significant drop in miles driven per person. So both electric vehicles and driving less. By 2030, we'd want 20% of cars, like 50%. The electricity would be up to 74% renewable or nuclear or hydro, zero carbon. And then as you go beyond 2030 to 2040 to 2050, by 2035, basically 100% of new cars would be electric. And that's how you could get that bar down by 2050 of the gasoline consumed by cars. You basically have to reach 100% of new sales by 2035, because if you keep selling the cars in 2036 or 2037, they're most likely still going to be on the road in 2050. So that kind of illustrates the time lag in the stock rollover of the vehicle fleet or of heaters. I think there's a couple more. So by 2050, we get to, in this scenario, 96% zero carbon electricity with 4% still natural gas. And that's even after having a lot more electricity demands than we have now. You want to keep going? Keep going. So there's just kind of another way of showing the difference between sales and stock. So for the example of, in this scenario, switching from natural gas furnaces to electric heat pump furnaces, over time, you switch over maybe around 2030, you have a 50-50 split. But if you look at it in terms of sales and in terms of stock, you're only barely starting to see progress by 2030. And that's just because the amount of new sales each year is only replacing a small fraction of the existing stock. So you have to wait, out until all of this time before most of the stock is turned over and become an electric heat pump. This chart just shows kind of where the energy is in the economy. Right now, this whole wedge is fossil fuels, and this is electricity. And by the end, we kind of turn that on its head. So the fossil fuels have shrunk down. We've replaced some of the remaining fossil fuels with biofuels. And then electricity is providing most of the energy services in the economy. So it's really kind of the story of electrification. And if you want to go to the next slide. And this is another way of saying that this is the total electricity energy generation. So efficiency starts to reduce it a little bit, but then all of these new loads come online because you're basically converting from other forms of energy to electricity. So the electricity system almost doubles by 2050. And then next slide. Nevertheless, the electricity is increasingly renewables. So in this scenario, each of these is a different resource. So solar is the biggest one. This darker yellow is utility scale solar, and then the lighter yellow is rooftop solar. And then we also have a bunch of wind contributing. And wind is not something that we have as much within the state as we have in some of our neighboring states. So in this scenario, we assume that we're going to build new transmission to access that wind to help balance the solar, because having a greater variety of sources helps you always have electricity when you need it, because during the night the wind might still be going. And if you didn't have all this wind, then you'd probably have to have more batteries. So that could potentially add some cost, although less and less as batteries get better and better. So that work that we did for the Energy Commission, the good news is that we had all of these different pathways that had different assumptions, and they all met the state's climate goals. The challenge is that we have to kind of move from these sort of industrial policies of, a lot of people don't even know that their electricity is almost 50% renewable already, because the utilities are taking care of it and you're just getting your bill at the end of the month. Maybe it's, a little bit more expensive, hopefully not dramatically more, but you're not having to change your kind of daily habits. And moving forward, we're going to be interacting with people's daily life a lot more. So getting people to change out the heaters in their homes and the kinds of cars that they drive. And then even with all those things, we still don't sort of have everything on the table that we need to get to 2050. So we still need innovation, maybe to have more hydrogen, kind of retooling of industrial processes, a better version of biofuels, etc. So I just have a few slides on kind of what we've been working on most recently and what I want everyone to keep thinking about. So the buildings are kind of an interesting challenge because there's two different avenues that we could go, and they both have their own kind of advantages and disadvantages. So I talked mostly about the heat pumps option. Another option would be renewable natural gas, such as making methane from biofuels. So the electric heat pumps, the challenge is that you have to start now in order to get progress 20 years down the road because of the long life of building equipment. And a lot of people don't want to deal with changing out their heating system, and maybe it burns out and they don't have any heat, and it's not a great time for someone to be like testing a new system that wasn't installed when the house was constructed. Also, people are very kind of familiar with gas stoves and don't want to give those up. And in contrast to conventional electric resistance stoves, which are very, poor performing, induction stoves are a kind of better alternative that people are starting to use. So this is one that I bought. It's actually just kind of like a $50 portable model, but you can get a whole stove too. And the whole stoves tend to actually be more expensive than regular stoves because they're sort of a higher end niche market. But if you go to Asia, they're actually like cheaper than regular stoves. With the renewable natural gas, it's kind of more of a problem of it's a great option if we knew where to get the gas from, and none of the options is looking really great because the biofuels, there's just not obviously enough to work with. Other options would be kind of more technology innovation. So some people have actually proposed removing CO2 from the atmosphere and then putting renewable energy into that and making it into a fuel. So that would be an option. It may be kind of the only option for things like airplanes, but it may not be the best option for home heating because it's sort of, you're taking a very expensive fuel and using it for a relatively low value use. So this slide is something interesting because the state has just made a commitment to 100% decarbonized electricity based on SB 100, which was passed and signed in October, I think. So there's this word called Dunkelflaute, which is a German word that basically translates as dark doldrums. So there's times when you don't have much wind or solar because those are inherently variable resources and you don't control them. They just are what they are. But you might still have a lot of electricity demand during those times. So the traditional system, customers just kind of plug in and they expect the electricity to be there. So if you want to maintain that, you have to have some sort of backup power. And, people are talking about using batteries for that, but batteries don't really fully solve the problem, at least not the battery technologies that we're familiar with now, because you need more than a few hours. You would need like a whole week of all of the electricity coming from the batteries. So there's a bunch of different solutions. Probably don't have time to go into all of them now. One example would be, okay, you just save some we don't have that much biofuel, but if you save it for when you really need it, you can kind of ride through these times. And it's easy to store, to have extra renewable natural gas, biogas, or renewable diesel sitting around for this kind of use. Another kind of way to go would be, like, right now we have this thing called demand response. So when it's like the hottest day in the year, they will, tell people to turn up their thermostat a little bit to have less air conditioning. And this would be kind of taking that to a much deeper level where, maybe you have the worst week in 2 years of electricity availability. So some industries will just not operate that week voluntarily, ideally. So that would be another way to address this issue.
But that would implies political decisions to force them doing so, right?
Political and also economic. You'd have to basically make the incentive high enough that it would make more sense for them to shut down for a week, and thus doing, save enough money in the rest of the system to make it worthwhile. So instead of building a whole backup system, maybe it's cheaper to just pay them to not operate that week. Next slide. And then kind of picking up the theme I was talking about before, there's still sort of the sectors that we don't really know the best solutions for. And at the same time as SB 100 was passed, Governor Brown also committed the state to having a net zero economy by 2045. So that means instead of just getting to 80%, we basically get to 100%, with some allowance maybe for some negative emissions on one side of the ledger, balancing some remaining source of positive emissions. So it's actually a much more challenging goal, and no one's really come up with the roadmap yet. That's something we're going to be thinking about. And it probably means that you need something like this to have, some sort of negative emissions to compensate for the positive emissions that you just don't know. Currently we don't know how to totally get rid of. And then one more slide, I think. So things that are kind of more political questions that are important for everyone to think about as we consider these really big transformations. There's always this tension between the role of consumers and the role of governments. So, sometimes people like to think, if everyone just, buys the right car, just kind of behaves as a totally altruistic consumer, then we can solve all the problems that way. And that's kind of one perspective. Another perspective is, governments just need to decide, write treaties, and enforce laws so that everyone, is forced to come along together. And in reality, you need both of those things, and you have to kind of have this balance between forcing people to change their behavior and, having voluntary behavior. So that's just kind of an ongoing tension that I think we're seeing. Another whole set of questions revolves around equity and what's called environmental justice, which relates to the fact that often the biggest polluters are the least vulnerable to the pollution and vice versa. So there's local examples where, the petroleum refinery in Richmond or the Port of Oakland have historically been surrounded by much poorer communities. And there's basically a political decision that the place to put those industrial facilities was where there'd be the least political opposition. So that's kind of one side of it. And people also talk internationally that the U.S. has created the biggest single has been the biggest single contributor to this problem. So maybe we should be paying more, and countries like India and China that are just starting now to have their own emissions should be given more time to, given more leeway, or we should be paying them to help them decarbonize. One thing that's been of real interest to me personally outside of work recently is the connection with housing policy. So that's kind of a potential inconsistency in the attitudes that a lot of people have in the Bay Area, where People are excited about technological solutions like having an electric car or putting on solar panels, but there's a lot of opposition to, say, building apartments in people's neighborhoods. And that means that people have to drive, 2 hours to get to their work because we don't have the housing located where the jobs are. So it's kind of an example of, where it really kind of pivots around equity in politics as well as technology. And then the final point for consideration is that we've been talking for a while about carbon tax and cap and trade. That's been kind of dominating the policy discussion, I think, for the last 20 years of let's just have the right carbon price and the market will figure it out. And we're increasingly seeing a push for while the problem is just so big and we have to do stuff so quickly that maybe we need a much more active role for the government. What's being called a Green New Deal, which would be basically like a massive kind of government infrastructure program, trying to create jobs and, maybe put in a new electricity system, new electric vehicle charging, all the transitions that we need to do at the same time. And of course, be potentially expensive and, it's something that's an active source of debate right now. So thanks, and happy to take questions.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
What do you think about so two of the things with regards to the economics? One of the things I was interested in is I heard a lot recently about green bonds instead of carbon credits, because carbon credits are very complicated and they seem to be kind of stuck. And green bonds are something that cities can get involved in quicker, and people understand them. Banks feel more secure about doing them. More people are interested in looking at investment that way. What do you think about?
I'm actually not familiar with green bonds, so it's something for me to learn about.
Yeah, I think that San Francisco is doing something. I think maybe it is a newer thing, but I think I'm hearing more about it, and I think I kind of like the idea. I was very excited about carbon credits, but I also feel like it's gotten a little stuck.
Why is that?
It's hard to, well, you probably know more than I do, but I would say that it's hard to quantify, right? It's one of the biggest problems.
You have this question of additionality or incremental, demonstrating that if you're paying someone to not emit, that they wouldn't have already done that, in which case you're sort of paying them for, not changing their behavior and not changing the emissions. So it kind of creates a lot of complicated counterfactuals, and you can't have two people paying for the same bit of emissions. So let's say you're paying a landholder to not cut down their forest, you'd have to sort of have a tracking system that, you're only taking credit once for that, and that they would have cut down their forest anyway if you hadn't paid them. So it has all those sorts of issues.
And with the carbon credit, can poor countries sell a carbon credit to rich companies or something like that?
That's the idea. It hasn't. So there was kind of a scandal where a bunch of Chinese factories were doing this. It was called the Clean Development Mechanism. And so a bunch of factories were basically manufacturing refrigerants and then burning them and claiming credits for destroying them before they put into the atmosphere. So it's kind of a lot of people are very leery. And so this California, rightly so, has limited carbon credits to only be 5 or 10% of the emission reduction, rather than something that we're relying on for the bulk of the reduction. It's also sort of people think about it as we have to be responsible for our own emissions first, and then rather than just kind of buying off.
I agree.
One other question is, when you were talking about incentives, do you feel that you see, for example, if you had something with some of your graphs you were talking about, how would you get the companies to do this for the people, and I've been hearing more about perhaps they could get tax credit, if they did have to shut down, for example, for a week or something like this. one thing a government can do is they can either penalize them if they don't, or they could also reduce their taxes if they do.
Right.
Instead of figuring out a payment method of how much would you pay the company, to
Mm-hmm.
for that week, which would be such an administrative nightmare for every business to try to figure out, it would be interesting to see how that would work. I mean, it would almost have to be, in America we have like cities and states and federal, and it'd be interesting to see how that would work in your scenario with regards to how you're, how local are you getting with where you're managing the energy.
Yeah, something we're thinking a lot about is kind of, is this better federal, state, city level? Right now we're seeing a lot from cities and states because the federal government is moving backwards. But, ideally, you kind of work at all levels. Regarding the paying industries, just to be clear, it's something that we already do, just at a much, much smaller scale. So there is already a program, kind of the worst hour to a year to pay people to interrupt their power. But the scenario I was talking about would be, maybe you do that for several days or a week at a time. So it's just sort of a much deeper challenge.
Do we actually produce enough electricity to be able to feed an entire automobile park?
I didn't show, I guess I do have the chart of the electricity generation. So that's kind of where that out-of-state wind is really useful. So we have kind of just enough solar in-state if we don't import any electricity, but would be starting to put pressure on other uses for land. We'd be using, I think, something on the order of 1% of the state's land area if we keep driving the same amount and we use all in-state electricity. But if you start using imported wind from Wyoming or New Mexico, or use offshore wind, you could much more easily make up that generation that you need. But there's some states that have it harder. So like New York, we've been doing a lot of studies, and New York is colder, it's less sunny, it's a much smaller land area, there's more people. So inherently they need to rely more on kind of trading with their neighbors or doing sort of the most expensive solutions first of offshore wind, where you have kind of floating turbines instead of on land.
All the figures that you showed was for California, right?
Yeah, we have a lot of projects elsewhere, but kind of the projects I've worked on the last couple of years have been mostly California, and then also for this audience I figured would be the most interest.
The objective for 2050 seems pretty ambitious just for California, and God knows that we're more motivated than many other states. So how optimistic are you that we can actually reach or come anywhere close?
That's a version of a question that we talked about an hour ago with students. And I think one thing that makes me optimistic is you see there's kind of a generational difference in attitude towards this issue, and you see a lot of young people already on board with we're gonna have to live with this problem. We didn't create it, but we need to solve it. Another reason for optimism is just how quickly the technologies can change. So California is basically playing this role of kind of being the test bed, and we have the resources, we have the interest, so we're gonna get all this technology working and then make it cheap. And then Iowa already gets 40% of its electricity from wind, not because they necessarily want to be green, although a lot of Iowans are still in favor of that too, but because it's cheaper and they can sell it to other states. But it's not going to happen on its own. There's still a lot of work to do to get there.
And we need people to sit on a table. Political people.
Yeah.
Presidents, right? And on a global scale. I was discussing with the headmaster just before about how in some countries they can change things pretty quickly. For example, China is changing, but for other countries like India, it's much more difficult, right?
Yeah.
Well, like France.
Oh, like France.
Yeah, just to change the energy policy.
Yeah. It's hard to see it happening fast enough with just kind of market forces alone without concerted effort by governments all actually being committed to it.
Actually, I think that like if you look at the 4-year span for like an Uber changing taxis, or like if you look at these, what do they call these technologies, disruptive technologies, I think things can change very fast. So sometimes the negative information scares people enough that they'll want to do it, but if we could work more toward the incentives, I think like the reason Uber and Lyft and all these, the same companies in France and everything worked is because people went for the personal question everybody has of where is my taxi, and they solved that problem, and then everybody wanted it. So it may be just in like you were saying with the scooters, or that's if you find the personal incentive on something, that fire spreads much faster than the pressure from above.
It becomes sort of a personal, kind of selfish motivator rather than an altruistic motivator.
And so a lot of studies are now being done on the disruptive technologies that are kind of like what motivates people and how can we connect that to climate solutions. It's kind of interesting, and especially you see it, I think, in food waste, which is another big one, not energy related, but it's a big climate adjuster. So, and there's a lot of people looking at food waste and motivators. So, it'd be interesting to see what happens with energy. I think energy is it's such a great jobs maker, right? That's a big plus for youth and everything to look at it, like all the potential for jobs. I think is exciting.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Subin.
Thank you.
We have